screen.
Desculpem a interrupção. Então, o Matt é uma referência nessas áreas e ele, né, como eu, né, tem um interesse grande na obra do Henri Lefebvre e é sempre parte das nossas discussões mais recentes. Em Newcastle, ele leciona Economia Política Internacional, Política Mundial e Política Cultural, né, Cultura Popular, na verdade, e Relações Urbanas Internacionais. Aqui no Rio de Janeiro, quando o Matt está com a gente, o Matt leciona tanto matérias de Economia Política Internacional, quanto também matérias ligadas ao módulo de mobilidade, espaços e temporalidade. A gente, na verdade, lecionamos juntos já há algum tempo. Então, uma grande alegria estar aqui com um amigo, né, e colega, Matt, e nesse fórum, especificamente, da IPS, e propondo um diálogo entre a IPS e a economia política internacional, né, que é um diálogo necessário, né, e não suficientemente explorado às vezes. Enfim, aqui e ali, mas é um diálogo necessário. É muito, muito interessante como é que tenha se proposto a fazer isso através do artigo dele, cuja releitura eu recomendo, né, dele e da Lacey Tedesco sobre Aesthetic Cities, né, que faz uma leitura muito interessante da obra do Melville, né, sobre The City and the City, que aliás tem um seriado bem interessante baseado no livro dele. Ok, então, sem mais delongas, eu passo a palavra ao Matt, que vai falar durante uns 30 minutos, 30, 40 minutos, e depois a gente vai abrir a pergunta. Ok? Matt falará em inglês, mas Matt entende português perfeitamente. Então, vocês podem ficar à vontade para fazer perguntas a ele em português. Am I right, Matt? Or am I exaggerating?
Well, I'm really grateful for such a generous estimation of both my impact and my Portuguese capacities. I do make it a habit, and I'll go ahead and do it now, to apologize actually for doing my presentations in English, because I'm extremely aware of the hegemony of the English language in academic circles, and I feel that it does not reflect well on me to be speaking to a Brazilian-based audience and not to have been able to get sufficient skills in Portuguese to be able to express myself. And so that's a burden on me, which I'm laboring to try to correct as best I can. But Joao's right. I think if those of you who are listening would prefer to ask me questions in Portuguese when we get to the question and answer period, if you're more comfortable in speaking Portuguese, then it's likely I'll be able to understand what you're saying. And I will probably nevertheless respond in English, though, just to not tax my poor little brain too much and make horrible errors. That, and I'd also wanted to start by giving a special thanks to João and to Renata for this invitation. I think the people in the room will be fairly aware already of the history of international political sociology, and my guess is that one of the lessons for the ways that some of the methodologies that predominate in this particular field might have taught us is that origin stories aren't the most important or interesting things we can actually tell. But I think all the same, it's important to acknowledge, and it's certainly well worth understanding that it's very long not have taken the form or made the advances that it has without all the really tremendous efforts that João in particular has made, both as someone who was in the earliest possible discussions about the founding of the field, but also having been a managing editor for the key journal of international political sociology, which, when it was in his editorship, was actually the most cited journal in the International Studies Association's constellation of journals. So in some ways, it's really a deep honor for me to have been invited to speak to the Rede IPS Brasil, because it sort of feels like I'm speaking to the home of IPS. And so that's really wonderful. And then Renata's also worked hard to make me help me make this possible, not only in the technical sense, but as I think we'll see as we go along, that as a collaborator. In fact, I'll say more about that in just a moment, but if it's okay, I think I'm going to bother you guys for just a minute while I try to sort out sharing the screen. And then here we go. Yeah, share. And if I can get to the... I am sharing the screen. It did not, oh no, it's loading. I see, here we are. Okay, and yes, and PowerPoint is gonna be bothering me a little bit, so just bear with us for 1 second here. So the only other thing I really wanted to say by way of an introduction, very quickly, was that this is what I'm giving you today is not specifically a research presentation. I'm actually drawing on several different research projects in the way that I put this together. Excuse me, and they're all at different stages of development. The purpose today is primarily to explore the ways in which the notion of the aesthetic city might stage the dialogue that I'm proposing here between IPE and IPS. Now, the aesthetic city is a concept which I started developing, as João mentioned, in an article with Delacey Tedesco, and it's in Globalizations. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw Paulinho provide the link to that article. If you have trouble finding it, you can drop me an email, and I'm quite happy to share it with you. And I'll also have more to say about the article below. But I'm also going to be drawing on work that I'm doing with João in an article that we've been working on urban regeneration in Rio de Janeiro. Also a chapter on favela museums that I'm working on with Renata. And then finally, an article that I'm working on with Ana Clara Teles, who some of you might know, which is on policing favelas. So I want to acknowledge the importance for me of working collaboratively. So each of my colleagues has really pushed and pulled me in different directions. And that's really helped me to think some of these issues through a bit more carefully, I think. I think it underscores the importance of collaboration, and it also underscores how concepts are not property. That said, and with the acknowledgement of my collaborators, I also want to own the fact that they may not all agree with everything I have to say. And this is one of the other issues around collaboration. And so any errors, mistakes, misunderstandings, lack of clarity that comes out of the presentation today is my responsibility and not those of Renata, João, Ana Clara, or Delacey. Excuse me. I've had this thing in my throat for a little while. I'm going to try very hard not to be doing that into everybody's ear. I'm really sorry. So in what follows, I'm going to discuss why cities might be important for thinking about the possibilities for international political sociology and international political economy. And then I'm going to discuss aesthetics from the same perspective. Now, there's a very vast literature on all of these topics, and I don't think I can possibly do a proper review of that literature. So mainly what I'll be doing is going to entail some rather rough conceptual overviews. And I'm going to follow those overviews with a little bit of visual analysis to see if we can't make some of the ideas a bit more concrete in their presentation. From the outset, I want to stress that I at least don't see IPS and IPE as hostile camps that must be reconciled. If there is a cleavage, then I think it's a cleavage in the sense that China Miéville indicates cleavage as a contronym. That's to say, how to cleave means both to cut apart and to cling together. So why cities, right? Why should we talk about these issues from the perspective of cities? In other words, and this is, João mentioned this, the undergraduate course that I teach here in Newcastle is on the Urban International. So what is that? What would the Urban International be? Cities, I think, in the first place, we can describe them as objects of analysis through political sociology. And there's a few things we might think about then about the kinds of political sociology questions that would arise from thinking about concentrations of people in urban settings. So some of these questions might include things like what social hierarchies can emerge in relation to the social functions, right? In other words, in relation to the division of labor. Second, what kinds of culture or modes of styles of life or modes or styles of life are afforded by urban concentrations? Third, what is the impact of the built environment on the distributions of bodies, of social functions, and of life chances? And then fourth, what are the political relations between urban life and rural life? Now, it's interesting to me to note that each of these questions is also already a question of political economy. The concentration of people in cities is related to industrialization, dispossession, and the like. The division of labor is related to the questions of social hierarchy. The built environment is a product and thus reflects the predominant mode of producing, etc. So at this level, it's easy to it's not easy to specify a separation or a division of political sociology from political economy. However, there are some contributions to approaching the issue that can be said to come from a political economy perspective. So let's think about something like financialization. Right now, financialization has been really driving the prices of assets up. And one of the reasons I think that there's a reluctance to reduce the interest rates in the context of inflation, because that's where a lot of finance is tied up. Primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession also tells us something about the movement of people from rural to urban contexts. Combined and uneven development has a lot to tell us, or could actually help us pose questions about how cities are different in global or international relations kinds of contexts. And when we think about the social relations of production, the different modes of subsuming labor is something that I think might pose really interesting questions for thinking about how the built environment is built and how it is related to other kinds of spaces. Excuse me. Now, in relation to the problem of the international, I want to, and I'm going to follow, I think, Didier Bigot and Rob Walker's formulation here. It's an article which I'm sure you guys are all quite aware of on the problem of the international. And I'm going to be talking about the international in those terms throughout, because I think it's important to keep that in focus. What IPS and IPE can do is to help insist on this problem of the international rather than to reify the international into something like a scale or a level of analysis. So in relation to the problem of the international, urban geographies have been making important insights into the spatial politics of the city in relation to the problem of the international for quite a while. This is a little bit of what João and I were working on in our article on urban regeneration, was a kind of a response to some of what urban geographers have been trying to do. So we have, on the one hand, from urban geography, we have the notion of global cities, which has emerged, and their global networks. In contrast, another concept of planetary urbanization, which has to do with urbanization seen from the worldwide scale. And then there's the post-colonial critiques of Eurocentrism that inspired the work in so-called ordinary cities. Now, it's notable that the various conceptions in geography do not start from any disciplinary separation of political sociology from political economy. Each conception draws on and has its own images of the political, of the social, and of the economic. But these are all operational in the concepts and provide some basis for comparing or assessing the various conceptualizations. But in relation to the problem of the international, it's also noteworthy that each of these concepts, with the possible exception of ordinary cities, tends to reproduce a limit noted by Bigot and Walker, inasmuch as they scale up their political sociology of the city in ways that suggest either an overcoming of the problem of the international, similar to the ways that notions like globalization or cosmopolitanism see the rolling back or the irrelevance of borders as obviating the forms of politics that are given by the international. Bigot and Walker argue, and convincingly in my view, that a political sociology that is attentive to the practices of bordering and producing limits will have a much better analytical purchase on the problem of the international than approaches that presuppose either the effectiveness or the obsolescence of borders. Right? Agreed. But then how can we address the problem of the international from the city? If we return for a moment to the question of the problem of the international, part of what's at stake here is the hierarchical tripartite partition of the political in IR, right, from citizen, state, and systems of states, and then how this hierarchy limits the horizons of what we can say politics might be. And I would add, it also limits our understanding of subjectivity in related ways. So consider who or what can act and decide or have intentionality in the imaginary relations of the subject to reality determined by this triad. Right? It's because these are political limitations to the subject that borders and boundaries must be policed. Warren Magnuson's call to see like a city was precisely an effort to recover the political from these limits imposed by the imaginary of IR's practices of sovereignty. So how can seeing like a city disrupt the distribution of the sensible that's inscribed in the problem of the international? Now, before advancing, for a quick review, if we were to analyze or critique cities in relation to the problem of the international, then from IPS, we might then turn to conceptions of bordering and boundary practices and how these are related to processes of urbanization. We might turn to understandings of mobility and how this is shaped by the urban, or to conceptions of spatial relations, such as the translocal. And I want to tip my hat to Renata here for introducing me to this concept, right? which are needed to account for the social relation in the context of these bordering practices and of mobility, and how all of these shape the limits to political possibility in a given urban setting. Similarly, cities might help us enable a critique of the problem of the international in terms of political economy, via the political economic analyses of forms of subsumption of labor in the production of the built environment, of the social relations of production and of reproduction that urbanization shapes, or of the effects of financialization, dispossession, commodification, and property relations on access to the space or to the right to the city. Next, then, if that's why cities, what about why aesthetics? And I'm going to here talk a little bit about the aesthetic subject, and this is drawing largely on the article that I published with DeLacy. Now, there's a striking logic, already alluded to in my reference to the policing of borders, that in the ways that more conventional forms of international relations would have us take borders for granted, if borders are either just givens or if they've been superseded, then there's nothing to see here, right? The logic then is about making the problems of bordering nonsensible, right? IR is about anesthetizing the perceiving subject. Now, a common sense notion of aesthetics, which derives largely from Kant, refers to the effort to find the a priori principles for making aesthetic judgments, which largely point us to how we encounter artworks or how we judge things to be beautiful, right? For the idea of the aesthetic city, however, DeLacy and I drew on a very different conception. So first we looked to Susan Buck-Morss and her readings of Walter Benjamin. Buck-Morss argues that aesthetics and anesthetics are not in the Kantian principles of aesthetic judgment, but as understanding the conditions of possibility for perception itself. And then secondly, we look to Jacques Ancier, who understands aesthetics as a partition or a distribution of the sensible. I'll develop these ideas a little bit more as well as we go. Oops. Now, DeLacy and my article start in an effort to extend Mike Shapiro's concept of the aesthetic subject, and I think this is probably a concept which most people will be aware of. Shapiro also relies heavily on Rancière here for his conceptions of aesthetics and politics. Now, on the subject, Shapiro does a very nice job of sort of situating a difference for him. For him, in most political science research and literature depends on a notion of the subject which Shapiro refers to as the psychological subject. And for him, that's a subject that's an individuated subject which has certain kinds of properties. And then the study of politics is a little bit about how we correlate the kinds of attributes we find in any particular kind of subject with particular processes or outcomes in the political world. And Shapiro rejects this idea, as I think DeLacy and I do as well, in favor of something like an aesthetic subject, which for Shapiro, and I think this is following Deleuze, he sees the aesthetic subject as that subject which we encounter that calls us to think, right? That's the subject that becomes a subject in this encounter between subjects. Now, Shapiro locates the aesthetic subject in his own writings in artworks, right? For example, in novels and films and like. And DeLacy and I wanted to try to go a little bit beyond this. In other words, not to confine the aesthetic city to cities that might be represented in novels or films, right? But to see the city itself as a subject. So to do this, we draw on two other theorists to flesh out the concept of subjectivity that might afford us this possibility. First, we draw on the work of Gayatri Spivak, and specifically on the article on scattered speculations on the question of value. In this article, Spivak begins by asserting that there are a materialist and an idealist predication of the subject, which are mutually exclusive. For her, the idealist predication of the subject is consciousness, or the subject's intendedness towards a kind of object. The materialist predication of the subject is labor power, and thus the possibility that the subject is superadequate to itself. In other words, because labor power is the source of surplus value, the subject is always capable of being more than what it already is. It's a process rather than a thing. Excuse me. Now, for her, neither of these predications is reducible to the other, and each predication mutually excludes the other. So what we have here is an aporia, right? An undecidable moment between understandings of subjectivity. Spivak finds that the predications of the subject are what she refers to them as metonymic accounts, right? In other words, they're parts that refer to putative wholes. They were standing in for putative wholes. They cannot afford rigorous conceptions of the subject, and I think this is important because we'll get to method in a little bit, right? They can't afford us rigorous conceptions of the subject. Rather, they invite fictive accounts. A rigorous conception of subjectivity will necessarily fail to conceptualize the subject because it remains fixed and abstracted and subjected to the externalities of analysis. Efforts to conceive the subject rigorously in this sense result in defining and constricting the political possibilities for the subject. Fictive, on the other hand, suggests to us that the subject is produced, an always not quite adequate description that, in falling short, impels ever new fictions. The subject is orientated, therefore, towards what Spivak calls wild practice, rather than to theoretically grounded analysis. The other theorist we draw on here for discussing subjectivity is Jody Dean, who's also really important for our work. And Jody Dean makes a very provocative assertion regarding the description of the subject by likening it to the enclosures, right, to an enclosure, which is the appropriation of a common resource and the exclusion of those who have made common use of it. When she does this, Jody Dean inverts Louis Althusser's formula. So you'll recall that for Althusser, ideology is the imaginary relationship of the individual to the real, which interpolates individuals as subjects. And Jody Dean argues that bourgeois ideology interpolates the subject as an individual, inverting Althusser. She says, the individual form becomes the site of struggling desires, drives, ideals, anxieties, organic processes localized at best in a provisional being formed of heterogeneous elements. I'm going to read a sort of a lengthy quote from Dean here to show why I think that her approach, giving us access to a kind of a collective model of the subject opposed to an individuated one, is important politically. And she says, rather than a dynamic force of collective willing, desire appears as a personal longing, right? This is what individuation does, right? Rather than an inescapable circuit of activity, drive appears as addiction, right? Recognizing the people as a collective subject becomes all the more challenging because the terms of what counts as the act of a subject are truncated and distorted. Instead of being heterogeneous, conflictual, temporary, unbounded, and in need of support from objects and figures that exceed it, the subject is, as an individual, is impossibly and fantastically independent and enduring. Now, how do we get to cities then as aesthetic subjects? And this is going to be a little bit of my note on method. The city is aesthetic in the sense that it is a technology for the distribution of the sensible. The city distributes bodies and functions according to the designs of planners. Its infrastructures enable mobilities in convenient directions and speeds. The very everydayness of living in a city pushes such designs below the threshold of critical engagement. This makes the patterns and rhythms of the daily commute, the leisure trip, the search or performance of work, the retreat to the domestic space of reproduction and recreation, into given spaces in the same ways that the territory of the modern state is given in IR. Material metaphors, urban fabric, fleshy densities, these, we might ask ourselves what material metaphors might help us make sense, help us to sense and make sense of cities as aesthetic subjects. What forms of wild practices and of politics do cities as aesthetic subjects generate? Excuse me. I'll say a little bit more about this notion of metaphor as method. I've kind of hinted at it already with the quote I gave you earlier from Gayatri Spivak. Metaphors do not function as a definitive statements of what is or objective analyses of what is known, but they are rather evocative practices that build relations of meaning by understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another kind of thing. This is Lakoff and Johnson's argument. Jacques Rancière, however, also emphasizes the importance of such evocative practices. He says, the argument linking two ideas and the metaphor revealing a thing in another thing has always been in community. In other words, argument, rational argument, linking these ideas, and metaphor, right, discovering the properties of a thing in another thing, have always been together. Now, metaphors, if we think about what they are, right, metaphors are by definition apparatic. They emerge from boundary practices that both separate and connect to the terms, perceptions, and experiences which are set in relation. While metaphors interact with and depend on other metaphors to constitute complex and more or less coherent patterns of meaning, as aporia, right, as apparatic, these patterns are operative without being inevitable. Let's look at these in a little bit of detail now. Let's start with the metaphor of the urban fabric. In the first place, fabric gives us a sense of interlacing or interweaving. So when we think about the urban this way, we're not necessarily saying that there's a loom, right, that weaves and warps and weft the things that put together something like an urban fabric. The fabric is a metaphor which explains to us the interweaving and the interlacing of material and social infrastructures. Fabric also allows us to think about the urban fabric from the perspective of fabrication. So remember, I mentioned from both thinking about international political economy and thinking about Gayatri Spivak on the materialist predication of the subject, bringing fabrication into focus with this particular metaphor tells us that we can think about the cities in relationships to the material predications, the materialist predications of the subject. The idea behind our understanding of aesthetic cities is that in modernity, the urban fabric plays a crucial role in shaping the possibilities for perception, that this shaping helps define present political possibilities, and that the perception through the urban is therefore an objective of political struggle. The other metaphor I want to talk about here is that of flesh, right? The fleshy densities of that Delacey referred to in our article. Flesh is a term which comes from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but also Jean-Luc Nancy, the notion of chair, right, in French. And for in particular, for me, I rely a little more heavily on Merleau-Ponty just because I've read him more than I've read Nancy on touching. But there are two ideas, I think, that this flesh actually, this metaphor of flesh gives us possibilities for doing analysis. And the first that Merleau-Ponty insists on is the notion of reversibility. Some of you may already be aware of this, so I apologize for being repetitive about things. But when he says reversibility, what he means is that he's talking about the possibility that that when you, for example, were to take, if you take one hand and touch it with the other hand, you could say that your right hand is touching your left hand, but it would equally be possible to reverse that, right? That the left hand is also touching the right hand. And in fact, again, as with other metaphors, there's no decidability between this. They're both touched and touching. Merleau-Ponty extends this notion of reversibility to say that it also works if you're shaking somebody else's hand. You're both touched and touching in that particular moment. It's this possibility of this reversal between this co-constitution of the subjects in their relationship that he gives him this idea that what constitutes the social is something that looks like flesh to him. That doesn't mean that literally we're in a David Cronenberg movie, but rather that flesh as a metaphor works to help us understand how our perceptual encounters with the world outside of us is always reversible in the sense that that's also the world's encounters with us, and that we're co-constituting through all of that. So touching then involves more than just this passive receiving of a touch. It also, and very interestingly, Merleau-Ponty has invisible in the visible and the invisible. He discusses this relationship of the visual world. He starts by trying to explore the differences between seeing and touching, but then he begins to move into territory where seeing is actually also involves palpating the object, right? But vision is the palpating of the object with the look. Now, the aesthetic possibilities of the city as a work, right, as a space of users, thus emerge across a wide range of artistic, practical, and social practices, strikes and demonstrations, and the tactics deployed to police them, right, the touch and the touching, also have aesthetic stakes, right, just as much as like things we normally think of as being aesthetic, like graffiti or documentary photography or architecture, right? The habitual and prosaic rhythms of urban life distribute sensibilities as much as the disruptions to the aesthetic regime of urbanism bring new subjectivities and possibilities into view. The politicizing of urban space through contestation, dissent, confrontation, and resistance is the obverse of the policing of the urban through control and consent. So let's talk again, return again to the problem of the urban international. And here what I'm going to try and do is be a little bit more concrete with all the sort of conceptual theoretical stuff I've done right now and give us some pictures to look at as well. And I want to just sort of do a little bit of a quick reminder of where we got to before I push on with this. So when I've talked about international political sociology, I've associated or affiliated certain kinds of conceptions with it. And those are so far mobility and immobility, bordering and boundary practices, everydayness and ordinariness. Those I've associated them with political sociology, and IPS certainly has given us important advances in understanding these things in the international realm. I'm not trying to confine those concepts to a particular discipline, right? I'll come back at the end to the notion of cleavage. And quite similarly, right, I've associated or affiliated certain concepts with international political economy, like the subsumption of labor or financialization or primitive accumulation or uneven development. And all of these concepts, I think, similarly, I think, are ones that political sociology can and has said quite a lot to us about. So when I try to set these fields apart a little bit, I think I'm doing precisely what I've described above about this idea that by making this cleavage, I'm also indicating the way that they cleave themselves together. And then aesthetics, I've also kind of affiliated a certain number of concepts with or notions with aesthetics as well, such as perception, fleshiness, reversibility, metaphor, apparatic boundary practices, right? The apparatic boundary practices, and so all of these are things which I'm going to try to use now to make a little bit of sense of a few images. I think all of these are images of Rio de Janeiro. I think most of you may recognize some of these images, but what I want to try and do is look at them and see if we can actually see how they stage precisely these encounters between international political sociology and international political economy. The first one is a photograph that was taken around the time of Operação Verão, which I think some of you will remember. And I think this is such an iconic picture because this is very clearly a picture that refers explicitly to at the manifest content level, right, of the idea of policing mobility, right? We're trying to decide how and where people can move, and this also very much brings into operation the notion of boundary and boundary practices. So you're not allowed to go beyond this point if you don't have the right documentation. And this is being policed, and I think the violence in this image is actually quite clear. I'm also going to suggest, however, that this is a relatively overt enjoining of the kinds of concepts that we can see operational in international political economy as well. So as we know, the reason for Operação Verão was to try to stop the arrastões that were taking place right on the beaches, right, which are bad for tourism, which are about robbery and theft, right? They were all about calling into question certain forms of access to space and property relationships. So I think, again, in this image, we can see already there's a kind of a way that it's not easy to necessarily separate as distinct disciplines, international political sociology, international political economy. To be able to make sense of the processes that are being illustrated here, we really need to be drawing on both. Again, very similarly here, I think we have, I've put together two images that I took from the Rio on Watch website of Parque Carioca. You'll see why I've chosen Parque Carioca in just a moment. Well, actually, I'll go ahead and tell you now. These are the houses that people who were removed from, or the apartments that people who were removed from, or evicted from Vila Autódromo were moved into, these new build houses in the West Zone. And there are kind of two important images at stake here. In the one that's on I suppose it's on all of our left, there's a lovely sign that somebody's hung outside their window that says "Quero dinero meu," I want my money, which I love because it sort of gives us a sense again, what is the political economy of this displacement of these people. I'll say more about that in just a few minutes. But the other image, the one on the right-hand side, I think also then does a very nice job of complementing that image of this space in a view that talks to us about mobilities and immobilities, right? And boundary and bordering practices. Why is there a chain link fence around this particular space? Right? It's there in order to try to police the space, to contain people, to tell them where they're supposed to be. This may be less clearly international or speaking to the problem of the international than you might have thought, but I think the next images will bring the international into focus quite a bit. Again, credits were due. These are photos that Renata took when she and I took a fieldwork trip to Vila Autódromo and the Museu das Emoções. The image on the left, right, is a sign that the museum, if you've never been to the Evictions Museum in Vila Autódromo, what they've done is that they've actually kind of memorialized where houses used to be before they were knocked down when Vila Autódromo was basically leveled in order to make room for the Olympic Village. And what the people who were able to continue being residents in the area after the political struggles that surrounded the evictions, what they've done is they've tried to memorialize the space as it existed before by leaving signs around to say this is where someone's house was, along with certain little slogans about the nature of the political struggle at the time. You can see that this is no longer a house. And then when you pair that with the image that's on the right-hand side, which was taken almost about 180 degrees behind the one that you're looking at now. They were not far away from each other where these two were taken. You're looking out across towards one of the buildings. I think that was one of the buildings that had been built for the Olympic athletes, but what's taking place in the foreground, in the background there, is Rock in Rio. And so the reason then for the evictions in Vila Autódromo was precisely around the international political economy of inserting Rio into this network of global cities and of opening up this space for investment, for financial investment. It was specifically a form of primitive accumulation where people were dispossessed, and the space was ostensibly then turned into commodities, right? Especially apartment blocks, or space for these public events, which define the public in a particular kind of way, at the expense of the people who lived there before. So the political struggles around Vila Autódromo are ones which are both inserted into international forms of political sociology and international forms of international political economy. Here I want to talk a little bit about the question of IPE and the subsumption of labor. And I've put these two images together. They may not have quite as clear and obvious a connection with each other, so I'm going to explain it why I've put them together. Again, the image on the left is a handful, an older image. This one was again taken from Rio on Watch, but I think it was a Rio on Watch. Got it from the Museo do Horto, the Horto Museum. And these are people who were a photograph of people who were early residents of Horto. I was looking very hard to see if I could find a photograph of people building the houses there. These are listed as moradores, so rather than construction workers, as builders. However, I think it's pretty clear these people are involved in the construction simply by I think we can infer it from the state of the constructions around them. And the one gentleman in the middle there, I think from what he's wearing, I believe we can sort of assume that those are people involved in construction. So here we have a certain thinking about the people who built Horto were also the construction workers, the builders who helped to build the botanical gardens. The longer story most of you will know is that they were slaves or freed slaves who were brought to Rio to help build the botanical gardens, and they were the original residents of the neighborhood, which is now known as Horto. And so the people who are doing that labor would be engaged in labor in terms of what Marx would have referred to as the formal subsumption of labor, right? In other words, their incorporation of their labor, of their labor power into the building sites would be done in ways in which the labor was subsumed to the accumulation of capital, but formally, which means that they would still have some autonomy in terms of controlling both the labor process, right, the pace at which they build, the design of the things they build. On the image on the right is from the Praça do Samba in a Complexo do Alemão. And what you're looking at is that tower was actually something that was built by the police when they occupied the area. They came in, not only built the tower using the materials which were taken from houses around the area, the Praça do Samba in Complexo do Alemão, but they also used local houses to store materials when they were doing the building. And they also blocked off mobility in the area as they were, to be able to make this tower an observation tower in the area. It was made it harder for people to get around in the neighborhoods. And of course, this was done against the will of the people living there. I think we could describe that without too much stretching the metaphor as the real subsumption of labor, right? This is now where the labor that went into the construction of this particular building was subsumed to the capital accumulation projects, right? That's to say, how do we make this space safe, right? In order to make the capital accumulation projects at large safe. The labor would have been really subsumed in the sense that it would not have operated with any kind of autonomy. The labor that goes into building this is itself fully subsumed under the logic of capital. So again, political sociology and political economy can tell us really important things about the processes, the political processes that we see taking place and unfolding in these two areas within Rio. And then finally, turning once again to questions of aesthetics and a reversibility. First of all, I wanted to talk a bit about anesthetics. And this is an image that, again, to credit, João found this image for me. And we used it when we were originally talking about some of the things we were thinking about in the urban regeneration project in Rio. And you can see, I think, in these side-by-side images that were produced to try to make a bit of a denunciation of the way that the tourist industry of Rio de Janeiro was trying to represent the spaces of Rio to make it possible for people coming from abroad to travel safely, in their view, in the city. They simply erased, right? They anesthetize us, right? They make our perception impossible. They erased the existence of this particular favela, which you could then see if you were to look in Google Maps. We know it's there, but the Rio Tour map erases it. This doesn't sound like reversibility just yet, but bear with me, please. These two images are, again, probably the one on the left might be known to you all. This was a cartoon that was published in a newspaper in Rio de Janeiro in the early 20th century. That's Osvaldo Cruz, who was the sort of, the guy who was known as being the person who cleaned up Rio, brought health to the area, still very widely celebrated. But the image itself, I think, to contemporary eyes, is one that we find quite disturbing, right? These are highly racialized images of what the favela was, who lives in it, and then it defines the problem of the favela in ways that are about hygiene, right? The problem is we need to cleanse, right, the favelas. When we think in contemporary terms, this notion of ethnic cleansing actually carries a much uglier connotation than it might have done for people at the time. And I pair this right alongside this image that, again, it comes from the Museo do Horto, and this is an identity card that was given by the Agriculture Ministry that was given to people who were working on the construction and the development of Horto. So this would have been a gentleman living in the area who would have been working on the construction in the botanical gardens. And the reason I think this is interesting from a reversibility perspective is that what we see is that there's a way that the state itself even has to speak back to the kinds of racialized and exploitive representations of space that the state used in order to try to rebuild the space itself. Right? In other words, the image of this dangerous, dirty place isn't itself complete, because in order to actually represent the people who are doing the work, we have to represent them as people and not as lice, for example. And then this, I think, is my last image for you. Again, talking about reversibility. I don't know if you guys will know these two images. The one on the right is one I use all the time because I really love it. The one on the left is an internationally known famous artist named David Elia, who, and this particular artwork, this installation was called Stray Bullets, right? Balas Perdidas. And as you can see, these are plastic lawn furniture that have been drilled with holes, and then the holes have been coated with gold. So these are put on international exhibits. It was part of what has been referred to as favelization, right? This idea of favela chic, right? Where around the time of the Rio Olympics, this idea that rather than treating the favelas as invisible places, dirty, dangerous, don't go there, how could we turn them into something that would be a selling point for the international community to think about Rio as being this interesting, funky, unique kind of place? Well, the images of the bullet holes here, which are being used for purposes of commercial accumulation and artistic, I'll use the word advisedly, professional artistic career advancement, I think make a really interesting contrast with the image on the right, which is Saint Sebastian, one of the patron saints of Rio de Janeiro. This particular graffiti was painted on a wall near Praça Mauá, on a building that was marked for demolition. So I don't know if this particular picture can still be seen, or if the building might have been knocked down by now. As you can see, the image of Saint Sebastian is the arrows that would have pierced his body and the religious icon have all been replaced with bullet holes. So here I think we have the reversibility at work again, where the touch of not just of the bullet in the body, right, but also of the image of the bullet in the body takes on a particular kind of meaning, which invokes then its response, right? This is kind of what we mean, what I was trying to get at when I started to think a little bit about wild practices. João, I'm sorry, how am I doing for time?
You reach 40 minutes, so
Okay.
I guess
yeah, I'll wrap
you
up.
should be closing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll wrap up. I was going to read a little bit of the conclusion from mine and DeLacy's article, but you guys can read the article. I won't read it to you. What I'm going to just sort of wrap up is I think I think these two images that I've kind of tried to bring out from the beginning may help us think a little bit about the relations between IPS and IPE that could help us stage a kind of conversation that João in his introduction signals as being overdue and important. And that's not to see them then as necessarily hostile, separate fields in need of reconciliation, but to think of them through the way that I've been trying to use these metaphors of cleavage and reversibility. In other words, there's a way in which they are different. They have been separated, right? The way we divide knowledge and knowledge production is something which has obeyed particular forms of the development of the academy, of divisions of labor, et cetera, et cetera. Those cleavages, though, also entail a way in which the pieces cleave together. And I think that might help us to think about how to think about these relations between IPS and IPE. And then similarly, again, drawing on these aesthetic terms I've been trying to develop here, these relations between the two fields might be thought about then in terms of their reversibility. So as we invoke a concept from international political sociology, it will bring about a need to respond through international political economy, and vice versa, right? There is no question of a priority of one over the other. If I had a little bit more time, I would talk about those boundaries as apparatic and the importance of the undecidability. And maybe we can come to that in Q&A. But I want to also just sort of put to you guys some questions to think about as we carry on the rest of our discussion. So whether this idea that I drew from Gayatri Spivak about politics as wild practice is sort of underdetermined rather than overdetermined, is something that escapes these kinds of efforts to try to confine us within these apparatic boundaries through the metaphors or the concepts that we get about. Do those also then, does aesthetics help us uncover some of those aporia? And then finally, whether that gives us a certain kind of access to seeing a new ways of thinking of the politics for the urban international. Thank you guys for sticking with me for 40 minutes. I hope I kept the pacing reasonable, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks very much. I think there are many interesting aspects of your talk that we could explore, not just in themselves as issues of political relevance and have a lot to do with the world politics today, but also regarding the dialogue or the exchange between what you call a political sociology and a political economy. I can think of, I could not think about that, for instance, when you showed us the tower in the favela as an expression of accumulation, right, of capital extracting labor for capital's sake. I immediately thought about panopticism, which is very popular in IPS. So the idea of surveillance. So I think that those are interesting conversations, right, about what the city does.
Yeah.
Right, the city, and not just as a built environment, but also as an aesthetic object. So, but I don't want to say much now. I'll reserve my questions for you later on. I would rather open the floor to everyone who's here. You can either raise your hand or just say something. But I'd like to thank Matt for this very thought-provoking talk and look forward to the discussion. So the floor is open.
Well, this is either a very good sign or a very bad one. I knew I should have tried it in Portuguese. Não, impossível. Não posso.
Hi, Matt. So while I know that people are taking notes and perhaps we're just like digesting and trying to present some of these issues. So I don't have a question, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be fair with my comment here, but I'm just going to share some of my like something that bothers me in relation to well, it's not like in a negative way. Of course, this is fascinating, so thank you for the work and the presentation and everything.
By the way, feel free to be negative. I don't think I have all the answers or anything.
But whenever I engage the literature on urban spaces, urbanization, from like critical urban politics and thinking politics through these spaces, I just wonder how this is, well, this is a subjective kind of, well, as you explained like very well in the paper, of course, cities as aesthetic subjects themselves. But I have this feeling that it helps us to kind of suspend a lot of certainties and a lot of understandings of the triad, right? The citizen and the state and the international. But at the same time, it reproduces a lot of things in our imaginary of the international. Whenever I think of like what's the international, and especially what's the modern international, the urban lifestyle doesn't necessarily contradict. Of course, when we look closely, we see that it's like much more chaotic than the idealized version of the urban, right? But it seems to me, from my very limited kind of perception, that there is a sense of the urban lifestyle or urbanization, or that kind of being like the reflection of the extrapolation or the excess of the modern international. And so whenever so that's why I look at the methodology and the way we can do the possibilities of doing this kind of work, but how we are not considering, for instance, other spaces that are even like in the outside of this outside. So when it comes to land, for instance, so indigenous land and how it problematizes the notions of citizenship and state and the international. I don't know if I'm making sense at all, but so yeah, so I'm struggling with notions of spatiality and temporality from indigenous perspective. How this literature on urban spaces, it's getting to me, because it from that perspective, the urban would be like the transition to modernity.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I kind of wish that I kind of wish that's my daughter. I kind of wish is that my dog? No, that's maybe somebody else. I kind of wish DeLacy could have been here when we were writing our article together on the city as aesthetic subjects. At the time, she was living in Cornwall, and one of the things she kept pushing back on me a lot was she's saying, "Look, a lot of us don't live in urban areas, right? We can't really use that as a kind of a universal kind of signifier." I want to give some due credit to the thinkers like Neil Brenner, right, who using this notion of planetary urbanization. He's not saying that the whole world is just covered by a city, right? He is actually talking about power relations. Although I think your observation about whether that is something which doesn't escape from the notions about the modern international is probably worth investigating a little bit more carefully. And I would actually, what I was going to think about as I was asking you this a little bit is I wonder, because one of the things I'm struggling with as well is this idea about the right to the city, right? So you mentioned notions about lifestyle and urban lifestyle. One of the things I think when Henri Lefebvre initially puts forward the idea of the right to the city, there's something really quite sanguine, optimistic, right, about the quality of urban life and what historically in Western Europe, you could see the urban as being a sign of mobility, where the rural would have been a sign of being fixed, tied to the land. Serfdom, right? And then all the sort of rural idiocy nonsense that was spoken of in the past. So in some sense, I wonder if a notion like the right to the city, which a lot of people are trying to use and resuscitate right now, is compatible with the notions that you're investigating around, for example, indigenous notions of the human relation to the land. Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it'd be a really interesting set of questions. If anything could come out of what I said today, I'm hoping that the way that the modern international is problematized by IPS and less problematized, but maybe should be problematized by IPE, might come to bear on that, as well as maybe some of the aesthetic approaches methodologically might be helpful for it as well. I don't know. I hope so.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Francine. Who else?
Gustavo, Tsikiza.
Yeah, can I?
Yes, Gustavo, please.
Thank you. Hey, Matt.
Oi, Gustavo, tudo bem?
Tudo bem, que saudade. So it may seem like I don't know if it makes sense with your work, but just hit me. When you showed the interventions from Oswaldo Cruz to Museu das Emoções, you're actually pretty much saying or portraying interventions as erasures. There's no houses there. Oswaldo Cruz did what he had to do, so to say. And I believe that there is no samba left in Praça do Samba even. So if it's so, and if art is remembrance and forms of punctuating this violence, what is and is there a space for institutional politics? Because it seems like it has been working only for these repetitive ways of erasures. And on your answer to Francine just now, you spoke about the right to the city as human rights. And here we are going back to political institutional politics by reaffirming politics and rights and what's human and what's not, so to say. And I'd like to see if there's anything from your anguish in writing and studying this these topics that would point somewhere of hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are huge questions. So I think when you say institutional politics, I'm gonna interpolate that, right, and suggest that you're saying something like policy. And then I'm going to retreat very quickly to my own interest in Jacques Rancière, right? And so that with Rancière, I would want to sustain a difference or distinction between what he calls politics and what he calls police, right? And policy would fall in the latter realm. One of the things I think that happens with us I don't know if it works this way in French, honestly, but certainly in English, there's a way in which when you use the word police in this context, it takes on a really negative connotation. So in some sense, it feels like, well, politics is a good thing, and this disruption of the sensible is what we should all be striving for, whereas the police order is a bad thing, because it's repressive and it doesn't allow us to do what we would do otherwise. It denies equality, for example. All that's true, right? But at the same time, I think when we talk about politics in terms of disruption, we are talking about something which is painful, dangerous, sometimes violent, where policing may actually be something which actually does allow us, right, to have a kind of an instituted basis in which we can actually operationalize and live our lives. So I don't want to go into the hierarchy of one or the other. That doesn't help us very much, I think, when we get to the question you put to me about erasures. And I think you've raised a really difficult point for me. That there's a part of me, romantic part of me, that likes to think that those erasures are actually in the end impossible. And when I look at what they've done in the Museu das Emoções in Vila Autódromo, right, they're not allowing that history to be erased, right? They're keeping it present. And all of the museums that Renata and I are looking at, there's an effort to try to memorialize, right, to preserve that memory and to preserve that memory in order to sustain a claim to that space that they had themselves produced. So but that feels quite romantic. I mean, and there are certainly plenty of people who have been evicted and who are not remembered, right? They've been killed, right? They've been disappeared. Their stories weren't big enough, or the resistance wasn't effective enough for them to be able to register on us, and they vanish, right? So there's a way in which the instituted politics is only sensitive to certain kinds of disruptions, are not effective in that regard. I don't know how close I'm getting to an answer to your question. I would love to be able to give you a sense about these as having some possibilities for policies or for instituted politics or for political parties to mobilize their own platforms, right? I would love to be able to think that that was all possible, and it probably is necessary, right? It probably, I would love to see more political parties foregrounding issues around equal access to housing, right? Housing is a right, right? There's a problem of the modern international gives us state-focused forms of politics that institute rights as being inherent in a particular kind of way of being human. And yet, if we could put something like housing, if we could put access to food, clean water and air, education, right, leisure and recreation, if we could put all those into that box of rights, I think we'd all be a little bit happier. But yeah, sorry, Gustavo, I have no idea. Maybe that's a failure of my part as a student of politics, but yeah, I wish I could answer that.
Thank you, Gustavo. Who else? Pauline.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for the presentation and perfect pacing. Even like the subtitle thing was going well. So thanks. I actually wanted to. I have 2 comments, but maybe I'll stay with the one just to get us back to the IPS IPE tension. I think because on the one hand, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to think this out loud a little bit. But on the one hand, the idea that these disciplines, and that's what Bigo and Walker say in the paper you were commenting on, right? The idea that we can deal with these disciplines as separate disciplines, part of the problem we're dealing with, as if we can speak of the international without speaking of these other things, etc. So on the one hand, I'm thinking, yes, of course, IPE and IPS and sociology and economy, all these disciplines, they're purport to be separate, but they can never be fully separate. So what I'm struggling with is trying to figure out what you take to be specific about the tension between political economy and political sociology. What is it that makes this particular encounter cleaved into 2 cents? You said separate, but I mean, in contact, yes, you showed us the contact, but what I'm not seeing yet is what actually makes the 2 sides of the cleavage, which is what also separate them, and the 2 of them specifically. So I'm wondering, for instance, at one point in your talk, when you're talking about formal and real subsumption, you bring us the vocabulary of the logic of capital. Well, okay, as far as I know, in IPS, the idea of a logic of X, Y, or Z doesn't fall too well. So is this maybe where some of the moment of difference appears? Or is it because when we look at problems through the questions of IPE, the problem of wealth is unavoidable, and then IPS, the problem of boundaries is unavoidable? So I guess I wanted to ask you to show us the moment of difference more clearly, where you think that actually makes it difficult or worthwhile, is a better word than difficult, to engage this encounter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And it's not something I thought about. So you've, as usual, I'm being pushed hard. I would say it's difficult too. I was going to just revert to something I said in the talk to try to clarify how I'm conceptualizing this. And I'm going to do this anyway, even though it's a roundabout way to get back to what you said. Because I think the difference is necessary. I don't think, and I think it's unavoidable, right? So, and what I was trying to get at is or at least as far as I got with this, as far as thinking about how to do that, was only really to think how that difference is actually constituted, and not, as I think you're pressing me to think about what it actually means. When I think about how it was constituted, and this will be where I sort of try to defend a little bit what I did, I was thinking about issues like questions about metaphor, the way that you find the logic or the presence or the appearance of the one thing in another, or the thinking about the way that China Miéville uses the notion of cleavage as a contronym, right? The way that he says it's always both, right? It's always both. Anytime you've actually made that cut, you've also sort of stuck the 2 things together in the ways that they. So the difference between IPS and IP is kind of what you suggested. That's right. That when you start to talk about the questions of mobility and boundaries, you can't you're invoking, right? You're bringing with that political economy is focused on, and I think it works the other way as well, right? And you've already said this, right? I think the minute I start wanting to talk about combined and uneven development, I've got to be talking about people's lives, right? I got to talk about how boundaries are working there. I've got to talk about where people are going and the possibilities that they have for going or being in particular places. So there's a more meta theoretical question you put there, which had to do a little bit with the questions about when you said whether the notion about, for example, I talked about real subsumption as something which refers us back to the logic of capital. That kind of notion of a logic as being operative is something which I think you rightly point out IPS is suspicious of. And I think the only thing I could do is sort of go back to someone like Spivak and say yes, and it's undecidable. It's both impossible and necessary, right? And that it's precisely that if I'm right to say that the processes we might want to look at around, say, mobility or locality, the kinds of things that I think are really interesting in IPS, are also always pointing at this thing that tends to live across the border in IPE, right? Then I think that undecidability is what Delacey talks about aporia as not being empty or gaps or limits, but actually being quite full, right? Aporia is quite generative, right? And I think that's the thing I would try to point at. But what I don't have a good answer to is your other part of your question about what is the operative difference between them. What is it that actually would define that separation? I suspect that's something I've got to think about a little bit harder, right? I mean, I don't think I could give more than a real facile answer about sort of intellectual history about why political sociology moves in a direction different to that of economics and politics, right? And I don't think that's a good enough answer to the question you posed. So it's just something I'm gonna have to think about. As ever, probably new stumps.
Thanks, Matt.
It's a great question, Paulinho. Yeah.
So, Matt, I have a question myself. I'm curious about how you move from a more Lefebvrean take on the city and the problem of the perceived and the lived, and thinking about the city as an œuvre, right, as a work.
Yes.
And how the people living in the city actually create as works of art sometimes, or as through culture, these spaces of representation where new practices or innovation happens, or the claiming of the city as a right. So all the Lefebvrean method, if you like, or also perspective on the city. And I'm curious how actually you moved to the notion of an aesthetic city, and you brought in these two concepts, the notion of material metaphor, and if you could speak a bit more about the material metaphor, and why do you feel a metaphor is interesting to think about the constitution of the city as a subject. So is the city as a subject a material metaphor? Is that what you mean? So it's not. So what is it? How much subjection or subjectivation does the city do as a material metaphor? And then I'm interested in wild practices very much. You didn't speak a lot about wild practices. And I think you pointed to them in your article, of course. You speak a lot about that. And I think it's really interesting how you articulate it in the reading about the two cities, right? The city and the city, because it had a lot to do with the interstitial spaces and in between us and the indecidability of subjects, right? And so forth. And I think that's the really interesting part, actually, of the talk. But I would like to see, because in your examples about Rio, sometimes we see a lot of examples of how the city has, well, played its role as this difference machine in the way that it discriminates, it produces boundaries, it evicts, it erases, a bit like Gustavo was saying, right? And I think some of your examples pointed to that, and it works to the real consumption of labor and so forth. But maybe if you could draw a little bit of even some of those examples, like the Museo of Jardim Botânico, right? Where you were, and that particular community, which was not erased, on the contrary, right? It's not only memorialized, but it resists, right? It's creative. It affirms itself in many ways. It claims the city. So perhaps you could talk about their wild practices a bit, or I'm interested in these two things, the material metaphors and the wild practices, pointing to what really makes your approach very close to IPS, which is the exploration of these spaces in this in-betweenness, these indeterminate, if you like, spaces. So yeah, the non-closure, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Actually, three really brilliant questions in there as well. I think I'll start with the Henri Lefebvre one because it's easier for me to answer, in part because I don't have a good answer for it. I strive for coherence in my thinking, and I routinely fail. And I don't like to admit this too much, but I'm a little bit of a butterfly, and this is why I started by the acknowledgement of working with lots of different interlocutors who have pulled me in different ways and made me be more serious about things which I might have been in another lifetime guilty of dismissing a little bit facilely. So the problem is I'm not sure how easy it is to weld or weave Lefebvre and Merleau-Ponty and Derrida, and I mean I could go on with the various clear interlocutors at stake here in the things that I'm trying to write about, and that they don't necessarily all like to live in the same bag together. So so the short answer to your question about how do I move from Lefebvre to the way of thinking about the aesthetic city is that is actually on my agenda of something to try to work through quite a bit more carefully than I've done. The nearest answer I could give on that one right now would be to say that there's, I think for me, a kind of a parallel form of argument or a parallel way of thinking about the city from the things I talked about as the aesthetic city, and the tension that Lefebvre, in the way that the representation of space dominates over lived space and spaces of representation, right? The spaces of the people who are responding to these. So when I had the last two images of the bullets in the chair and Saint Sebastian's bullet-riddled body, that was a little bit of what I was trying to draw on there, was as we've kind of got ways of thinking about how the state, how the city, how policy, how capital, how these all represent the space of the city for the purposes of surveillance, control, accumulation, et cetera, and how all of those forms of representation are living with and cannot contain the representations that come back to them, right? The representational spaces that come out of these lived spaces. So for me, the aesthetic city isn't necessarily a journey traveled to go from Lefebvre that kind of sort of lives in a Lefebvrean logic, but it may not live there very comfortably because of some of the other things I've got to pull on that actually Lefebvre was not particularly interested or keen on. The metaphor one is a good way to get to that, I think. Lefebvre was famously hostile to structuralism. So in this is all, of course, situated in French intellectual history. So for him, structuralism in the 1950s and 60s took on the form for him of a kind of form of technocracy, that this was a way of separating out forms of knowledge from the way that the lived experiences were constituted in everyday life. So he's very, very hostile to structuralism. And, you know, I think Derrida was also hostile to structuralism, but in a very, very different way. And these are very different kinds of thinkers. So when we go back and explore how does a metaphor work, right? And how does it operationalize these aporia that Deleuze and I were trying to bring about, that's a kind of analysis I don't think Lefebvre would have done. I don't, you know, I mean, it's not, he did write about literature, but it wasn't in that kind of idiom. So I don't know that I can make those things live together very well. It's certainly not something I've thought through as carefully as I need to. On the notion to say a bit more about material metaphor, I think that's a great question about, is the aesthetic city a material metaphor, or I had originally, actually when I wrote the paper with Deleuze, and I feel slightly uncomfortable speaking on her behalf because she might actually have a different answer to this. So you should take this as a 50% answer on that particular paper. I didn't see it in strictly metaphorical terms. And the reason I'm kind of bracketing Deleuze here a little bit is because I'm not sure, but from some of the ways that she pushed back on me as we were writing this article, she might not be as uncomfortable with actually giving metaphor a more ontological, thinking about it kind of methodologically, and I think she was thinking it a little bit more deeply than a little bit more of a deep kind of attachment than what I'm giving it right here. But the thing that convinced me in our conversations was this methodological turn that said, you know, that we don't need to be, in fact, we make politics much more incomprehensible, less apprehensible, less sensible, right? When we try to fix it in place and in time, when we use rigorous methods to try to isolate and separate the political from other parts of the world in order to be able to create psychological subjects, for example, as Mike Shapiro did. When we go through the kind of exercise in the paper to try to flesh out a concept of subjectivity which is not confined in an individual subject, but is actually the product of subjective encounters, right, of the mutual determination of subjects as they encounter each other, then for me, the city is a particular way of spatially organizing those kinds of encounters, right, or of affording those kinds of encounters, right, in different kinds of ways to others. Back to Francina's question, right, I think you know that the difference for me between what I understand to be, in a very superficial way, I'll own that right now, but of indigenous forms of understanding human relationship with land and territory, is one that doesn't have the same kind of properties that living in an urban environment does, or that cities actually afford. So for me, it's not a simple metaphor. I'm being a little reductive here. It's not a metaphor for me to say, oh, I'm sorry, this thing is popping up on me again. To say that the city is an aesthetic subject. The material metaphors are ones that allow me to be able to encounter and find those subjective encounters or the places where subjectivity is actually produced. So then, you know, what material then refers to is that we're moving metaphors out of the realm of language or of art or of literature, and saying that metaphors are also there in the fire hydrant, in the parking lot, in the public restrooms, in the bar, right? The buildings that we encounter and that afford and produce particular kinds of encounters between us that are subjective, right? So the city actually is an aesthetic subject, not because it holds a subjectivity or subject position, but it's an aesthetic subject because in its encounter with us, we mutually co-constitute. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the most interesting thing, and the thing I actually got into this particular presentation less than I was happy with at the end, is actually to think about this in terms of what wild practices mean, which is why I want to kind of defend a little bit the assertion of the material metaphor as a method, because what it points to methodologically, I think, is the inability to close, right, to foreclose the subject, the political, the spatial, right, in any particular kind of even temporarily fixed position, because it's always never going, it's never going to be adequate, right? It's never going to actually get everything. There's always going to be an excess. And that excess is not something which is over-determined, right? That by the multiple complex versions of politics and sociology and policy and international relations and blah blah blah. But it's underdetermined in the sense that it isn't something that's accounted for, and that the metaphors, by not being adequate to, right, and we can point then at operationalized concepts within quantitative methods and say that's also a metaphor, and it also doesn't do what you're asking it to do. Right? Because it's always that thing that's going to escape is always going to be that practice that actually will disrupt and that will make other possibilities come about. Too, also, I mean, I think the part of the reason that didn't make it into this particular presentation enough is because I think my encounters with Rio are heavily filtered through the distance I'm in. I thought about writing in my conclusion. I see two hands up, so I'm rabbiting on quite a lot. Just one last thing. I thought about writing in my conclusion something about the difficulties and the ironies of being a scholar of and in the global north, doing this analysis of a city that's not in the global north. And that there's hundreds of years of reasons to be suspicious of that. And I think that in some ways, my inability to talk about the wild practices that I want to try to foreground comes precisely from that positioning, right? So that when I do a search for images to try to illustrate some of the ideas I have, well, I can't find the images of wild practices because people don't take those pictures. That's not the image that they want to have. Another of the life in the city as they promote it to international audiences. The bullet chairs is a really good example of how that works, right? Here's something which might look like it's excessive kind of practice, is the lost ballot, the bullet, right? The one that wasn't intended to go there, right? And this form of violence that has all the trappings of randomness, right? And it's very clearly a wild practice, and it's something though that is presented to the outside world as aesthetic in that really reduced, unpleasant kind of form, right? Of something that begins to look like, well, this will allow you to feel a particular kind of way, either about your own superior position in the world or about your ability to appreciate difficult art or whatever, right? So yeah, I think that is a gap in not only what I presented here, but in my ability to present and discuss and talk about Rio. I think I have relatively limited access to those wild practices, and it's something which I hope to remedy. Yeah, but that might be difficult too, right? I mean, do I remedy it by writing it down and, you know, operationalizing it in terms of my own career development? I don't know. These are difficult. These are real difficulties for me. I see two hands, but I'm going to let you chair as well.
Yeah, Beto, please.
Hi, Matt. Hi, guys.
Beto.
Matt, thanks so much for this wonderful talk. Apologies for, being without and with my camera. My internet is telling me that it's unstable, so apologies if I'm out, and also apologies for me leaving in 15 minutes or so. Have to get the girls in the school from the school. But let me just share some thoughts and a question. Not actually a question. I would love maybe to understand better the move that you suggested from what Mike has discussed concerning aesthetic subjects to aesthetic cities. So here I'm thinking in two ways. I understand that somehow Mike discussed this in some places, drawing attention to certain micro and micro politics related to the aesthetic subject. So on the one hand, for example, when he looks how certain aesthetic subjects are moving in the city, for instance, it shows how there's this partition of the sensible, this politics of aesthetics, right, that constitutes the city in a very particular way. There's a kind of a political economy that partitions a certain way, and the aesthetic subject, right, serves to show this politics of aesthetic that is intrinsic to the way the city is constructed and so on. I was wondering, so from what I heard, I could see how by moving towards the aesthetic city, you could push towards this kind of problematizations and interventions, right? But on the other hand, I was wondering how that could be thought also in terms of a more macro political politics of aesthetics involving the aesthetics of cities or aesthetic cities. And in that move, I was thinking about Francine's commentaries, if I understood. So because and here I would relate my commentary with Spivak's, but in a different way. So if I remember correctly, one aspect of Spivak's famous Can the Subaltern Speak involves a certain critique of the epistemic violence involved in certain critiques of the subject, right? So in that case, if I remember, on Foucault and even Deleuze, the point was that in their kind of critique of the subject, right, they kind of universalize both the subject and the critique of the subject, and hence took them as this kind of unproblematized point or starting point for their critique, right? If I understood Francine's commentaries, what I was thinking is about a certain macro logic that is lost if we start with the urban and the city, which would mean, of course, staying within a very specific cosmology, a very specific archaeology, if you want to go with Foucault, for example, right? More recently, I was thinking about the mighty frame from Onuf and how he tries to reread the order of things through engagement with metaphors. But then again, you're still from a history that comes from Greece, passed through Rome, goes through Europe, and then you have the modern, postmodern, whatever world you have, right? So I wonder how, in many ways, one thing that gets lost, or possibly gets lost, is how, and here another way of Shapiro's engagement. So in violent cartography, right? When there are traces in certain cities space about these colonial histories and these colonial studies, encounters that gets lost. So I just wanted to push you in two directions, just to summarize. One, if you could talk more about the move from the aesthetic subject to the aesthetic city, and how, if you would agree on this kind of way of framing, you could not only zoom into the city, but also zoom out and think about this more macrological and historical place that the city has in terms of this kind of macro political politics of the aesthetic, if it makes sense, about if you consider the colonial politics related to the way we have the city and the urban in our contemporary imagination, most especially here in this context. I don't know if I made sense, Matt, but thank you so much.
Yeah.
As
No,
always.
Beto, makes perfect sense. Yeah, as ever. Yeah, it makes perfect sense, actually, and really, really interesting questions. I'm having a great time tonight, you guys. So I think the zoom in one is a little bit easier to answer than the zoom out, and and which is a weird thing to confess, given that I was trying to talk about international political sociology, international political economy, and the problem of the international. So I feel weird that I'm going to have a harder time with the second part of your question. The first one's not that difficult, though, because I mean, yes, the thing that at least in our readings of where in the time of the city, in the book on transdisciplinary methods, and places where Shapiro tries to give a particular analytical development of the concept of the aesthetic subject. He doesn't break out of the idea that a subject would be a figure, typically a human figure, a character in a book or a novel, that acts or behaves in particular kinds of ways that calls us to think. So he's not reducing subjectivity to properties of an individual. That's precisely what he's not doing. And yet, reading through his very, very productive encounters, I think, and he can show us a lot of real interesting stuff through his readings of books and novels and films and stuff. He's just a genius in that sense. But what struck us about this is that if we don't want to confine our notion of aesthetics to those kinds of products which might be sorted into a kind of an aesthetic experience, right? A priori, right? Those things which are there to give us the feeling of the sublime, right? That are the products that are there to make. We've had an encounter with an aesthetic object, books, novels, et cetera, then what if we began to think about the aesthetic encounters that we had, for example, outside of those particular forms, right? What if the aesthetic encounters that we have that he's describing, the thing that calls us to think, was actually in the space that we're occupying as we're doing these. In the article that we did with DeLacy, even though we're doing an analysis of the novel, one of the things we try to draw on is that, and this is why we use this notion of material metaphors, is that the novel's read by readers who live typically in cities, or at least in urbanized contexts, right? And context of the planetary urbanization that Neil Brenner talks about, right? That the books are produced and they circulate in particular kinds of ways. And so the notion that the aesthetic subject is something we can access by accessing an aesthetic product is something we wanted to escape from, right? So let's what happens if itself is something which is calling on us to think? And then we start to say, well, doesn't that suggest that the city is, that the subject, again, it's not it doesn't even have to be just a collective of individual humans. Now we can begin to think about the subject as some other kinds of assemblage or other kinds of congregations, right? The agglomerations of things, of the material. This is what I think we tried to think about, the urban fabric metaphor here, the interweaving or the interlacing of the social and the material, the ideal and the material. Properties that constitute the city in its motion, right? And now, so that's the zooming in part of it, right? We're not criticizing, or we're not even really providing an alternative to what Shapiro is doing. What we're doing is we're just pushing it back out of the book and pushing him out of the frame and the film, and saying, look, same thing happens when you're waiting for a bus as when you're reading a novel, right? These encounters, these subjective encounters, these aesthetic subjective encounters are happening there as well. The zoom, but I think it's probably possible. I don't think it's something that contradicts or undermines the things I was trying to do. Yes, it would be possible to be much more sensitive to the ways that, say, the colonial encounter actually shapes the form of the city. So again, in Joel's and my paper, when we try to write about urban regeneration in Rio, we gave I hope it'll show up soon. It's under submission. But when that paper comes out, one of the things we tried to do is to try to go back and revisit the notions of the global city and planetary urbanization, and to think through a little bit about how they even in the context of planetary urbanization, a very Lefebvrean idea here, it does reproduce precisely that logic that you were thinking about, that there's a kind of a historical trajectory that goes through the ways that the built environment that agglomerates particular kinds of people in particular kinds of places, with spatial relations with the spaces around them, as determined by Europe, which then spread out colonially. This becomes teleological logic, which I think then leads to this ultimate moment where the whole world, right, the planet, is being urbanized. And I think that is worthy of critique from a colonial and post-colonial perspective. And this is what Jennifer Robinson does in Ordinary Cities. She says, why would we reproduce this hierarchy? Why not? I think Abdul Malik Simon does something kind of similar when he looks at the kind of ideas about improvisation in cities in the global South, right? And what Ritu Avij and I are trying to do around the notion of slums as well. So in those particular contexts, I still think that this way we're trying to develop a notion of extending Shapiro's arguments about the aesthetic subject will in fact allow us to get to those particular kinds of moments of the city, how the city either produces and reproduces those forms of colonial domination, but then, as I'm trying to suggest here, by doing so also is producing those wild practices which extend beyond it, either temporally or spatially, right? So I didn't have enough of it in here, but that's a great question. There was one more, I think, as well. There was another hand up. I know I'm pushing the time really hard.
Camila, I think, yes.
Yeah. Oh no. Do you want to put it in the chat? A tua pergunta posso meter no
It's in
chat?
the chat. It's in the chat.
Oh, it's
yes.
in the chat. Oh.
Yes.
Okay. Ciao, Roberto. Ciao, Beto. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay.
Ciao, Beto.
I'm trying to write it. I'm outsider to this.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Tchau, guys. Obrigado, Matt. Tchau, tchau, João. Tchau,
Nada.
gente.
Tchau.
Desculpa sair
Até
antes.
mais. Tchau.
Tchau.
It's in the climate. Oh, yes. Oh, climate has received interpolates. Yes. That's a great question, actually. So climate is not something I write or know very much about. So I didn't want to go in the Kantian direction, right? I mean, but I mean, there's a kind of way in which this is the sublime, right? The planet's going to kill us because we're trying to kill it so hard, right? And it feels like it really is much more than we can possibly do. So, but I can't give you a good answer to the question because it's just not something I've engaged with enough. I've not thought enough about it. But my guess is that why not? Why not? Just as I think I suggested to Beto now that there's no reason that these kinds of thinkings about political economy and political sociology, about aesthetics and the aesthetic subject, about the urban and cities as subjects. There's no particular, the city as a subject might be something which might be really helpful for understanding both the consequences of our urbanization in terms of producing climate catastrophe and the difficulties that we face in trying to, the ways that we have embedded in certain forms of living. How I depend on, in England, I don't know, I haven't been in Brazil for a little while, so I don't know what's happening there. But here, this winter in England, something happened that probably should not have surprised shouldn't have surprised anybody, which was that vegetables vanished from our supermarkets. We couldn't get, tomatoes were gone, peppers were gone, cucumbers were gone. Now, it's February. Why would we be getting those things anyway, right? I mean, you could say from a kind of a climate sensitive position that that's pretty much out of season. But the problem is that it isn't just that we're dependent on the produce in England. We're not just dependent on the produce that's produced in Spain or in Morocco or even in Israel that is shipped here for us to be able to consume these lovely vegetables year round. And it's not just that we've developed senses of our own bodies that say, well, you need to be eating, 30 plants a week, and otherwise, your gut biome is going to go off, blah blah blah. But also, the farmer catastrophe was not just of me and my supermarket not being able to eat the veg I want. The problem was that the climate change, the droughts that were affecting the producers of these vegetables in Europe was actually disrupting those people's livelihoods as well. So to be able to begin to address the climate catastrophe thing, I think feels like it's something which it requires both an understanding of this kind of the way that these subjects are interpolated, the way we produce them and they produce us, right? The thing I was trying to talk about through the way subjects produce each other. This is on a more extended scale. It wouldn't necessarily be on an urban scale, and maybe it's an urban scale. I mean, again, we could talk about Neil Brenner, but I mean, let's assume for a minute that the logistics tying us together, that we're talking about relations with farms. Let's not assume that that's about cities. And then, but I believe that the kind of approach to understanding the politics of it that I tried to outline in the talk could probably be used in those circumstances. I think so. Yeah. I don't know if that ends.
I'm trying just to make a small amendment. Let me know if you can hear me well. And it's because I feel like the city, for some of us, it's like this safe space that separates us from the nature. So there is this safe space, these frontiers that keeps us in our, in a rural in a separate space, and you show the like this production of borders, but then there is this thing that we cannot produce borders over, we cannot like push it away, and I was thinking something like that. But thank you. I've been thinking a lot about it, and if you have any kind of reference, take, get in touch with. So thank you.
Yeah, please feel free. I mean, it's really interesting that you think about it. I hadn't stopped to think about cities as safe spaces, but actually it is precise. That goes back to, I think, the thing that Francine was putting to us a little bit before about the way that the city is constituted as something that's an extrapolation or a manifestation of the modern international. That's exactly right. The civilization nature divide that all lies on is precisely the stakes that you just signaled there about. And you know, it is kind of, it is, I don't know what to make of it right now. I don't know. I mean, I'm getting a little bit tired and punchy, I'm afraid, but there's something that's interesting in that I think that we could think about is the way that there is no separation between nature and cities. Nature is here in the cities, right? I mean, it's not just about the dandelions coming up through the cracks in the sidewalks. And you have all kinds of, in London, it's wonderful actually, the peregrine falcons, right? Raptors, right? Peregrine falcons have found that the tall buildings make excellent nesting spaces, and the city is full of pigeons for them to eat. So the idea that you could separate the urban environment from a natural environment, well, the nature's there, it doesn't go away, right? So yeah, there's a lot to be thought of, I think, in that context. I'm not sure I can answer your question any better than that, though.
Thanks, Matt. Victor, you have the last word. Well, the last question. The last word is Matt's, of course.
Possibly the last word.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Matt. This was fascinating. Good to see you. So, two very quick comments. The first one on the aesthetic subject and the wild practices. To make it very short, I would like to share with you is that sometimes these notions run the risk of being ontologized. Aesthetic subject and the wild practices. I've just finished reading a book that I found fascinating from Guillaume Sibertin-Blanc, Politics and State in Deleuze and Guattari, and they insist on the importance to understand the devenir minoritaire on Deleuze and Guattari as something that is everything but an ontologized notion of subjectivity. So he insists, Guillaume Sibertin-Blanc insists on the importance of understanding the relation between the historical transformations and power relation transformations, and what Deleuze and Guattari understand as minorisation, etc. So my first literature?
Is that minor literature? Is that what?
They are reading. He's reading Guillaume Sibertin-Blanc. Is reading Deleuze and Guattari in both Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and also on Kafka.
Okay.
But my point would be how to understand the relation between, on the one hand, aesthetic subject and wild practices, and the historical transformations that, by situating the aesthetic subject and the wild practice, make both also contingent. So another way to put it would be how to avoid these two notions to be ontologized. Is that clear? So my second...
sorry, go ahead.
No, so my second point would be one of the things in the fabrication of an urban international has been historically the erasure of the rural international. So my another way to put it is how to think the aesthetic cities. Also, the condition of possibility for an aesthetic city has been also the erasure of mode of existence. So I'll give you two examples. Both in Horto and in Vila Autódromo, historically, there have been places Horto related to a peasant racialized community, and Vila Autódromo related to a fishmen and women community.
Right.
And in name of modernization, they have become this part of peripheral cities. So would it be another aporia inscribed in the notion of a aesthetic city, that for it to make sense, the rural international must be erased? So another way to frame that is it necessary for us to reproduce the erasure of the rural international in order to speak of an urban international and of an aesthetic city? But
Wow,
thanks again.
Yeah, really hard questions. I think, given the time, and also given that I'm not well versed in Deleuze and Guattari, I'm not going to try hard to go to the ontologizing question. I would like to think that Deleuze and I, in our article at least, worked hard not to do that, in part because we both wanted to hold on to this idea of that any fixing is always contingent, right? So contingency runs right through what we're trying to say. Yeah, so whether we succeed is another question, right? And whether we would succeed in the terms that say Deleuze and Guattari put out. Yeah, I don't know if we do or not. I'm just not well versed enough in that literature to be able to speak confidently. I think on the other question, it's both. This is the aporia, isn't it? Right? Because one of the problems we have. This is part of, again, what Deleuze was pushing back on me when I tended to want to really keep a clear focus on the city itself, is not everybody lives in an urban environment, but it is a kind of another kind of stabilizing dichotomy, urban and rural, like so many others, right? It's that implies a kind of hierarchical relationship where one is the dominant over the other. And in terms of what you just put in the previous question about these questions about the historical transformation, certainly in Europe, I can't speak enough about Brazil to be sensible about it, but certainly in Europe, the relationship between the urban and the rural was always one of struggle and contestation, right? There, even in terms of historical transformations, when landed property in among barons in the rural areas would be the dominant forces, and how the emergence of a bourgeois class in the cities where capital begins to accumulate, begins to challenge that. And we get an English Civil War out of it, right? For example, we get the French Revolution out of these things. These are, I think, historic, the categories, the relationships between categories are historic. And I believe the categories themselves are entirely contingent historically. That's kind of why I wanted to say to Camila that nature doesn't leave the city. You're right about Orto and about Autódromo, right? And it's interesting. There was somebody did something really cool about there have been efforts in certain favelas in Rio, I think, to try to think a little bit about bringing gardening into the favela and to try to think about how urban gardens might be both a solution to, for example, providing food that might be locally produced, but even more interestingly, when you build roof gardens, to actually dealing with the heat in the city, right? So you've got an environmental thing. And one of the people they talked to was a guy who was able to bring the temperature of his house down by, a remarkable, like 10 degrees, right? A remarkable cooling of his house by building a roof garden. But the filmmakers who were talking to this guy were also talking to other residents saying, isn't that cool? Why aren't you doing this? Well, we don't own our house. We don't own this. We can't do this. Or I'm working all the time. I haven't got time to go up and build a roof garden, right? So the urban and the rural distinction was something which is having to be continually produced and reproduced in the reproduction of everyday life. There's Henri Lefebvre slipping back in for me again. The erasure is, I guess as tried to respond to Gustavo this way a little bit. I feel slightly less. I'm self-conscious of this because I feel like I may be romanticizing a little bit, but I'm watching. Orto actually has, and Gustavo asked this question about policy and instituted politics. But the people in Orto have actually succeeded in some ways of actually being able to at least temporarily stabilize their claim on the land that they occupy. Whereas in 2017, it looked like they might lose it. I told them that's a disaster, right? I mean, the 800 families reduced to 25 families in this space, and it was an effort to very much erase it. But the people who are still there, have not only been able to memorialize that space in the space itself, but it's also on a digital archive. You can go and look at the images and Autodromo on the internet now. So it's an archive which itself reproduces itself through, I guess we might describe as urbanized means, right? Through the internet, through electricity, through computer technologies. So my feeling is that, yeah, the erasures are there. There are political defeats. We have to think about what to do in the context in the face of political defeat. Being on the left, I think we should be used to that by now. It's been the story of our whole left-wing existence. And yet, it does feel like, as the saying used to go, a luta continua, right? It doesn't just stop because there has been a temporary setback or because there's even been a defeat and an erasure. That's a very poor answer to your question, Victor, because I think there's a lot more going on there, but I'm beginning to run out of gas and time. So I have to think more about it.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Victor. Alessandro has a question, but I think we ran out of time, Alessandro. Sorry about that. He put the question, Matt, in the chat. So if you want to take note of it and perhaps get back to Alessandro in the near future. But we did promise to limit our talk to actually an hour and a half, right, Renata? And we were reaching the 2-hour limit. So I'd like to thank Matt very much for opening the activities of the IPS Brazil network this year.
Alessandro, feel free to drop me an email, okay? I can't do justice to answer now, but feel free to write, okay?
And it's been delightful to have you here, Matt. And I hope that we'll have you with us more often and have these discussions more often. And hope that you'll be back in Brazil soon after the winter.
Saudade.
Right?
I should be there. I should be there in August, I think.
In the spring, I know that Victor will probably be with us in Rio at some point in the near future, right, Victor? So we look forward to having you here as well. And stay tuned for the next activities of the Brazil IPS network, which I don't have in my memory right now. But we'll be sending you the adverts. I don't know if Renata has something she wants to add.
No, just